The electrician called at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. I almost ignored it, trapped in a claims meeting, until his urgent text forced me into the quiet hallway. When I called him back, he did not use his normal voice. He just whispered, his breath trembling against the receiver. "Ma'am, please come home alone. There is a room behind the wall, and it is eating power from a source that is not on the blueprints. My name is Eleanor Kennedy. I am 39 years old, and for the last 2 years, I have perfected the art of looking completely undisturbed." I was sitting in Conference Room B at Crown Harbor Mutual, pretending to absorb a painfully dry quarterly claims presentation, when my phone began to vibrate violently against the polished oak table. It was a harsh, rhythmic buzzing. Once, twice, 3 times, the caller ID glowed brightly with the name Miles Dugan. He was the electrician I had finally hired that morning to fix a flickering overhead light in my late husband's home office. It was meant to be a simple job. It was a job I had put off for 24 months because I simply could not bear to open that heavy oak door and let the present intrude upon the past. I pressed the ignore button. Vivian Roque, the vice president of claims, was droning on about risk mitigation percentages and adjusting thresholds, and I took a slow, deliberate sip of my lukewarm coffee, trying to blend into the corporate wallpaper. Then, the screen lit up again, this time with a text message. I glanced down. The words were hastily typed, the spelling clumsy, radiating a frantic energy that instantly spiked my pulse. Urgent? Do not call back in front of anyone. The conditioned air in the conference room suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. I stood up abruptly, muttered a brief, practiced apology about a major client emergency, and slipped out into the cold, fluorescent-lit hallway. My heels clicked loudly against the linoleum as I quickly rounded the corner near the elevators, ensuring I was completely alone in the corridor before I dialed his number. Miles picked up on the very first ring. "Miles, what is going on?" I asked, keeping my voice low and controlled. "Is it a short circuit? Is there a fire risk behind the drywall? Do I need to send someone over?" He did not speak right away. When he did, his voice was not the gruff, casual, confident tone of the tradesman I had let into my house just 3 hours earlier. It was a thin, ragged whisper, the terrifying sound of a man who firmly believed the walls were listening to him. "Mrs. Kennedy," he breathed, the sound catching in his throat. "You need to come home, right now. You need to come alone, and you absolutely must not tell a single soul where you are going." My grip tightened painfully on the smooth glass of the phone. "Miles, you are scaring me. If it is a fire hazard, you need to step outside and call the fire department right this second." "It is not a fire," he interrupted, his voice cracking with an emotion I could only identify as pure dread. I found something, Mr. Graham hid behind the wall." The polished floor of the Crown Harbor Mutual building seemed to tilt violently beneath my feet. I did not ask him to clarify. I did not ask another question. I hung up the phone, walked straight to the executive parking garage, and got into my car. The drive to the Marlow Bluff neighborhood usually took 45 minutes of steady highway cruising, but the world outside my windshield blurred into an unrecognizable smear of gray clouds and wet asphalt. Driving through the familiar streets of Ashport, my mind was violently pulled backward, dragged kicking and screaming into the past. 2 years ago, that specific night, the relentless rain lashing against the bedroom windows, the heavy official knock on the front door at exactly 2 in the morning. I remembered the 2 police officers standing on my porch with soaked uniforms and heavy pity in their eyes. They told me Graham had slipped at the Briar Cove Marina. They said the wooden docks were slick with the storm, that he hit his head and fell into the dark, freezing water. They called it a tragic, senseless accident. They said the evidence was very clear, very straightforward. Case closed. But as I sped down the winding coastal highway, my knuckles turning stark white against the leather steering wheel, that one word echoed endlessly in my skull: clear. Nothing felt clear right now. My husband was a senior forensic architect. He spent his days analyzing building failures, structural collapses, and devastating electrical fires. He was a man of intense logic, unwavering precision, and strict adherence to code. He did not leave things to chance, and he certainly did not hide secret things inside the walls of our home. I pulled into the long driveway of our property. It looked exactly the same as it always did, a quiet, stately colonial home wrapped in thick, creeping ivy. But as I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the foyer, the silence of the house felt entirely different. It was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating, heavy, and expectant. "Miles," I called out, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "In here," came the muffled, unsteady reply from the second floor. I climbed the wooden stairs, each step feeling physically heavier than the last. I stopped in front of Graham's office. For 2 long years, this room had been a dedicated mausoleum. I had instructed the cleaning service to avoid it entirely. I had left it exactly as it was the morning he walked out the door for the final time. I took a deep, shuddering breath and pushed the door open. The familiar scent of his old cedar aftershave and aged drafting paper hit me instantly, like a ghost brushing past my shoulder. The room was perfectly still, a frozen, heartbreaking snapshot of his life. His large, rolled blueprints rested in the woven corner basket. His favorite tweed jacket still hung haphazardly off the back of his heavy leather desk chair. His silver fountain pen lay slightly crooked next to his leather-bound notebook, waiting for a hand that would never return. And standing awkwardly in the center of this sacred, untouched space was Miles Dugan. He was a broad, powerfully built man, usually flush with the color of manual labor, but right now, his face was the pale, sickly color of old ash. He was holding a yellow-handled screwdriver in a white-knuckled grip. He did not look at me when I entered. He was staring intensely at the far wall, the specific wall located directly behind the heavy mahogany bookcase. "I was trying to trace the wiring for the ceiling fixture," Miles said, his voice trembling noticeably in the quiet, dusty room. "The voltage reading was all wrong. It was drawing way too much current for a single, standard bulb. I followed the line down." He pointed a shaking dust-covered finger at the narrow space behind the tall shelf. I stepped closer, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. At first, I saw nothing but the smooth, gray-painted drywall we had chosen together 5 years ago. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the shadows cast by the afternoon sun, I finally saw it. A seam. A razor-thin cut running perfectly vertically from the wooden baseboard all the way up to the crown molding. Crafted so precisely, it was practically invisible to the naked eye. "There is a sub-panel in there," Miles whispered, as if raising his voice might trigger an explosion. "A secondary breaker box. It is not on any of the official house blueprints you gave me to review. It is pulling electricity from a source completely outside the main residential meter." "I do not understand," I said, my voice sounding incredibly small and fragile. "What exactly does that mean?" "Just watch," he replied. Miles reached out and pressed his wide palm flat against a seemingly solid section of the wall. Right beside the hidden seam, there was a sharp, distinct mechanical click, the heavy sound of a concealed latch disengaging. The solid wall suddenly popped inward. I gasped sharply and took a frightened step back. Miles wedged his thick fingers into the newly formed gap and pulled with steady force. An entire section of the drywall, framed in reinforced steel and set on heavy-duty internal hinges, swung silently open like the door of a high-security bank vault. The trapped air that spilled out of the dark cavity was incredibly stale and smelled faintly of hot electronics and metallic ozone. Inside the hollow space, a long strip of dim LED lights automatically flickered to life, casting a cold, pale, artificial glow over a hidden compartment that was roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep. It was absolutely not empty. My breath hitched, and my hands grew numb as I stared into the secret hollow. On the sturdy floor of the compartment sat a heavy industrial-grade fireproof safe. Stacked neatly next to it were 3 black plastic file boxes, each labeled with cryptic alphanumeric codes. A sleek silver laptop sat entirely closed on a small metal shelf mounted above the boxes. But it was the back wall of the secret compartment that truly made my blood run cold. It was covered edge to edge in a large, meticulously organized corkboard. The board was a chaotic, terrifying web of dense information. It was covered with tightly pinned photographs of scorched commercial buildings, detailed street maps of the greater Ashport area with specific city blocks circled in harsh red marker, long columns of insurance contract numbers, and dozens of crumpled, faded financial receipts. Connecting these disparate pieces of paper were thin, straight lines of black thread pulled tight around silver pushpins, creating a sprawling, obsessive map of a conspiracy I could not even begin to comprehend. I stepped closer, my legs feeling heavy and mechanical. My eyes scanned the terrifying collage before me. There were glossy images of charred, melted electrical panels, extreme close-up shots of degraded wires, official documents stamped with the bold blue seal of the city inspector's office, some with aggressive red lines slashed across the signatures. Slowly, I forced my gaze down to the heavy fireproof safe resting on the floor. Lying squarely on top of the cold, gray metal was a thick, pristine white envelope. It was addressed to me. The handwriting was sharp, slightly slanted, and completely, undeniably unmistakable. It was Graham's handwriting. My hands shook violently as I reached cautiously into the hidden space and picked up the envelope. I traced the deep blue ink with my thumb. Written cleanly across the front were just a few simple words, but they were enough to completely shatter the fragile, quiet reality I had desperately clung to for the past 2 years. Ellie, if you are reading this, it means the light finally led you to the right place. I stood perfectly still in the quiet, echoing house, holding the letter, staring blindly into the bright, terrible secret my husband had painstakingly built into the very bones of our home. The flickering bulb in the ceiling above us had never been broken. It was a calculated beacon, and the gentle, meticulous man I mourned had not just died in a tragic accident. He had left me a map to a war. I tore the heavy paper of the envelope with thumbs that refused to stay still. The jagged sound of ripping paper was deafening in the quiet space of the office. Miles had tactfully taken 2 large steps backward, giving me a fragile illusion of privacy, but his heavy breathing was still a constant rhythm behind me. I pulled out a single sheet of yellow legal paper. It was completely filled with Graham's tight, methodical script. I braced myself for a final declaration of love, a hidden goodbye, perhaps a drafted will he had never finalized. Instead, the very first line struck me with the physical force of a closed fist. If they say I died because of alcohol and rain, do not believe it. My lungs seized. I read the sentence again, then a third time, my eyes burning. Graham did not drink hard liquor, and he certainly did not wander around wooden docks in the middle of severe thunderstorms. The official police narrative had always felt wrong, like a poorly tailored suit, but seeing my own unspoken doubts written in his hand validated every nightmare I had suffered over the past 24 months. Ellie, the letter continued, for over a year before you find this, I have been watching our city burn from the inside out. It started as a whisper, a strange statistical anomaly in my structural analyses. I found a bizarre, repeating pattern connecting random electrical fires, massive commercial insurance payouts, and the sudden, unbelievably cheap acquisition of the very same scorched real estate right here in Ashport. He explained everything with the chilling, detached precision of the forensic architect he was. Graham had legal, undisputed access to disaster sites that ordinary people, and even standard investigators, routinely ignored once the fire trucks drove away. He wrote about sifting through wet, black soot and finding the impossible. He discovered that dozens of tragic electrical accidents were actually the result of highly coordinated sabotage. He found counterfeit switchgear designed to fail under specific loads. He found degraded, substandard copper wiring deliberately installed in crucial junction boxes. Most damning of all, He found that the official post-fire inspection reports were entirely synchronized and falsified. I tried to do the right thing. The ink scratched across the page, the pressure so heavy it nearly tore the yellow paper. I gathered my initial findings and quietly approached a contact at the local precinct. 72 hours later, 3 key physical files completely vanished from the city archive. A week after that, a senior city building inspector stopped me at a site downtown. He did not threaten me directly. He just looked me dead in the eye and said, "In Ashport, what burns should be left as ashes." Graham realized then that the rot went far deeper than a few corrupt contractors cutting corners. He was looking at an organized, incredibly lucrative ecosystem of destruction and profit. He knew he could not trust the police, he could not trust the digital cloud, and he could not trust the local banks. "That is why this room exists," he wrote. "I secretly hired an independent finisher from out of state, paid him strictly in cash, and had him build this alcove and the dummy electrical panel. He drove back across the state line the very same day. I needed a physical vault completely disconnected from any network, any server, and any digital footprint. Only analog isolation could keep this evidence safe." The letter instructed me to look at the bottom of the page for a 6-digit combination. I dropped to my knees, the rough carpet biting through my tailored trousers. My hands were slick with cold sweat as I reached for the heavy fireproof safe resting on the floor of the secret compartment. I entered the numbers. A green light flashed, and a heavy metallic clank echoed in the hollow wall. I pulled the thick metal door open. The smell of aged paper and warm plastic washed over me. Inside, the physical manifestation of my husband's secret life was meticulously organized. There was a heavy external hard drive. There were thick, bound folders containing complex cross-ownership diagrams, mapping out a web of shadow corporations. There were hundreds of photographs showing melted circuit breakers with their unique factory serial numbers brutally filed down to smooth metal. There were miniature cassette tapes of audio recordings, and 3 leather-bound personal diaries filled with his daily observations. The silver laptop on the shelf above contained his master encrypted backups and his terrifying, granular analysis of every single fraudulent insurance claim. I reached for the first stack of manila folders. I flipped through pages showing photographs of ruined buildings, long lists of claim codes, and the registration documents of obscure shell companies. My eyes scanned the dry bureaucratic text, trying to process the sheer scale of the theft. Millions of dollars were being systematically drained from insurance reserves to fund illegal real estate empires. Then, my hand froze mid-air. Near the bottom of the stack, nestled between 2 thick property deeds, was a slim, bright red folder. It had a clean white label slapped across the front tab. It read, CHM/Eleanor Access Trail. A sickening chill washed over my entire body, starting from the base of my neck and radiating down to my fingertips. CHM, Crown Harbor, Mutual. My employer. I opened the red folder with hands that felt completely disconnected from my brain. Inside were pages and pages of printed digital system logs. They were internal server records from the Crown Harbor Mutual mainframe. I stared at the columns of raw data, my mind struggling to translate the numbers and timestamps into reality. Then, I saw my own name. There were dozens of entries showing my unique employee credentials, my specific authorized login ID, accessing highly sensitive commercial fire claims. The logs showed my account actively opening restricted files, approving rapid payout closures, and overwriting critical field investigator notes. The timestamps painted a horrifying picture. 11 o'clock at night, 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning on a Sunday. These were nights I had been sound asleep in our bed, lying right next to Graham. These were weekend hours when I had not even glanced at my work laptop. Someone inside Crown Harbor Mutual had bypassed the security protocols, hijacked my digital identity, and used my clearance to rubber stamp the fraudulent payouts Graham was tracking. They were not just burying the truth beneath the ashes of Ashport, they were actively building a digital cage around me. When the authorities finally noticed the missing millions, the audit trail would not lead to the ghost corporations or the corrupt city officials. The trail of approved signatures and forced system overrides would lead directly and exclusively to Eleanor Kennedy. I was the designated scapegoat, expertly positioned to take the fall for a massive criminal enterprise. I dropped the red folder onto the carpet. The air in the room suddenly felt toxic. I picked up Graham's letter to read the final paragraph, the ink now slightly blurred by the moisture on my hands. Ellie, I am so deeply, terribly sorry. I did not keep this from you because my love faded, or because I did not trust your strength. I kept it from you because the deeper I dug into the ash, the more horrified I became. I realized this network had already crawled inside your building. It had infected your daily work. If I told you, you would have to go to the office every single morning knowing you were sitting in a room full of predators. I wanted to build an airtight case and burn them to the ground before they could ever spring their trap on you. If you are reading this, I failed. You have to finish it. Trust no one at the firm. It is a strange, disorienting violence to discover you never truly knew the person you loved most in the world. As I sat on the rough carpet of the hidden room, surrounded by the physical evidence of his secret war, I tried desperately to reconcile the man in these files with the man I married. Graham was never a brooding, cynical man who hid in the shadows. He was vibrantly, beautifully ordinary. He was a man who found profound joy in the simple act of repairing broken things. He was the kind of husband who would spend an entire Sunday afternoon patiently rewiring a vintage record player just so we could listen to old jazz albums in the living room. He left bright yellow sticky notes on our stainless steel refrigerator, writing silly jokes, or reminding me to grab my umbrella on cloudy mornings. He had warm, calloused hands that always smelled faintly of cedarwood and fresh drafting paper. He knew exactly how to make a room feel safe and bright, often installing extra dimmer switches and warm-toned bulbs just to make the house feel more inviting when I came home from a long day at the corporate office. That was the foundation of my grief. The man who built this elaborate, paranoid bunker was the same man who used to dance with me in the kitchen while the pasta water boiled. The true shock was not simply the existence of the massive criminal conspiracy outlined on the corkboard. The deeper, more agonizing trauma was the realization that for the entire final 12 months of his life, Graham had lived two completely parallel lives right in front of my eyes. We had shared a bed, eaten dinner at the same mahogany table, and discussed our mundane daily schedules, all while he was silently carrying the weight of a deadly secret. I had spent his final year feeling neglected, wondering why he seemed so distracted, so distant. Now I knew his mind had been buried in a nightmare. I opened the first of his leather-bound personal diaries, hoping to find some explanation, some justification for the wall he had built between us. His handwriting here was not the frantic, sharp scrawl of the technical notes. It was slower, heavier, weighed down by immense regret. Through these pages, Graham made a confession that completely shattered my idealized image of him. He admitted that he did not start this investigation out of a noble desire for justice. He did not begin as a hero trying to save the city of Ashport. 4 years ago, he wrote, he had made a terrible, silent compromise. He was reviewing a preliminary safety report for a massive, multi-million-dollar renovation project in the commercial district. The developer's team had submitted calculations that seemed slightly off, specifically regarding the electrical load capacities for the climate control systems. The lead contractor had offered a highly technical, seemingly plausible explanation for the discrepancy, citing a new, experimental green energy standard. Graham was exhausted, drowning in a backlog of municipal reviews, and facing immense pressure from city officials to keep the profitable development moving forward. He chose the path of least resistance. He signed his name on the approval form, allowing the project to bypass a rigorous secondary inspection. He believed their lies because it was easier than fighting. 7 months later, the consequences of that single signature manifested in smoke and ash. A different commercial high-rise, located on the opposite side of the city, but utilizing the exact same supply chain and contracting team, suffered a catastrophic electrical short. The resulting fire tore through 3 floors, forcing a massive evacuation and permanently condemning the property. Graham was assigned to the post-incident structural analysis team. Deep in the flooded, soot-covered basement of the ruined building, sifting through the charred remains of the main utility room, he found the truth. He discovered the melted, deformed husks of the power relays. They were counterfeit. They were the exact same substandard components he had unquestioningly approved in his previous, expedited report. The guilt he described in the diary was visceral. It was a suffocating pressure that kept him awake for days, driven by a desperate need to atone. He began to work backward through the wreckage. He traced every single wire and invoice. He investigated the wholesale suppliers, the municipal licensing inspectors who signed off on the installations, the financial brokerage firms that funded the initial construction, and the insurance conglomerates that underwrote the massive risk. The deeper he dug into the bureaucratic dirt, the more the isolated accidents began to link together. He realized this was not a few greedy contractors cutting corners to save a few dollars. It was a highly sophisticated, incredibly lucrative model of manufactured disaster. They were engineering failures to harvest insurance money. As I read through his meticulous notes, one specific name began to rise above the others, appearing at the center of the financial web. Hollis Vane. He was a prominent urban redevelopment tycoon, a man whose smiling face frequently appeared on the covers of local business journals. According to Graham's research, Vane never owned the properties when they actually burned. Instead, his holding companies magically appeared at the very end of the destructive life cycle. After the fire gutted the building, after the massive insurance payout cleared, and after the original property owner inevitably declared bankruptcy, Vane would swoop in as the savior. He would acquire the prime, cleared real estate for a fraction of its true market value. He was the puppet master turning ashes into empires, but Hollis Vane was a distant, untouchable figure in a bespoke suit. It was the second name, heavily underlined in thick red ink on a separate, loose piece of paper, that made the blood freeze in my veins. The conspiracy was not just out there in the city, it was sitting in the corner office of my own workplace. The name was Vivian Roque. She was the vice president of claims at Crown Harbor Mutual. She was my direct supervisor, the woman who reviewed my files, approved my promotions, and dictated the culture of our entire department. Clipped to the page bearing Vivian's name was a small, hastily written note. I picked it up with trembling fingers. Graham had written a direct warning to me. If you see Vivian acting overly gentle and compassionate after my funeral, you must understand it is not pity. It is a calculated test to see exactly how much you know. I dropped the note onto the desk as if it had burned my fingers. My mind raced violently backward to the days immediately following his death. I remembered standing in my living room, wearing a black dress, feeling entirely hollow. Vivian had come to the house. She had hugged me tightly, holding on just a few seconds longer than necessary. She had brought expensive catered food and sat with me on the sofa. I remembered her soft, sorrowful eyes as she asked gentle, probing questions about Graham's state of mind, his recent projects, whether he had brought any work stress home with him. I had thought she was being a supportive mentor, a maternal figure offering comfort in my darkest hour. In reality, she was conducting a threat assessment. She was looking into the eyes of a grieving widow to see if she needed to eliminate me too. I slowly reached out and closed the silver laptop. The soft mechanical click echoed loudly in the silent, dusty room. The tears that finally spilled over my eyelashes were not just tears of grief for the man I had lost. They were tears of profound, heartbreaking clarity. For the entire final year of our marriage, I had agonized over the growing chasm between us. I had cried myself to sleep on countless nights, convinced that our relationship was failing, that the love was simply fading away. Now, sitting amidst the overwhelming proof of his silent war, I finally understood the agonizing truth. Our marriage did not fracture because he stopped loving me. It broke because Graham had chosen a fundamentally flawed way to protect the woman he loved. He had deliberately pushed me away into the cold, thinking his emotional distance would keep me safe from the fire. He had isolated himself exactly when he should have trusted me the most, leaving us both to fight a lonely battle that ultimately cost him his life. The paralyzing shock evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp vacuum in my chest. I did not cry again. Instead, I retrieved my own secure work laptop from my leather briefcase and opened it right there on Graham's desk. For over a decade, I had been trained to spot operational anomalies, to hunt down mismatched dates, and to identify irregular payout structures. I was a senior underwriter for one of the largest firms on the eastern seaboard. They had targeted my husband, but they had made a catastrophic error by dragging their violent mess into my professional domain. I began systematically cross-referencing the cryptic alphanumeric codes from Graham's physical files with the live database of Crown Harbor Mutual. It took me less than 3 hours to isolate the exact cluster of losses he had been tracking. The targets were brilliantly chosen. They were aging boutique hotels needing extensive renovations, sprawling brick textile warehouses from the turn of the century, and mid-tier commercial office parks struggling with low occupancy. These properties were large enough to command massive, multi-million-dollar replacement value policies, but obscure enough that a catastrophic structural failure would not trigger a prolonged media circus or federal oversight. I tracked the life cycle of each property following the incidents. The pattern was undeniable. Between 6 and 10 months after the initial electrical fires, the original owners found themselves drowning in operational delays, sudden city code violations, and stalled reconstruction efforts. Under immense financial duress, they invariably sold the ruined lots. The purchasing entities were always different limited liability companies, boasting generic names and registered to empty retail storefronts. However, when I mapped the financing banks and the final legal signatories, the labyrinth collapsed into a single, straight line. Every single dollar flowed back to the same localized interest group. I dug deeper into the compliance history of those specific claims. Standard operating procedure dictated that any commercial loss exceeding a specific financial threshold required an independent, third-party reinspection before the final funds could be released. In every single case Graham had flagged, those independent audits had been abruptly canceled. The official files were quietly updated with internal memos citing natural equipment degradation or severe maintenance negligence. The final overriding signature on every single one of those manipulated closures belonged to Vivian Roque, but the most terrifying discovery was waiting in the raw digital access logs. I pulled the specific keystroke histories from my own employee account. My credentials had been systematically deployed late on Saturday nights and early Sunday mornings. My digital footprint was all over the system, manually lowering the automated fraud suspicion thresholds. My account had been used to waive mandatory extended investigations and to rubber stamp the release of the final settlement checks. If an external auditor ever cracked this network open, the data would point entirely away from Vivian and the shell companies. It would look exactly like a rogue mid-level manager orchestrating a massive embezzlement scheme from the inside. They were carefully, deliberately weaving my noose. I needed corroboration from someone outside the blast radius. I purchased a prepaid cellular phone and contacted Boyd Kessler. Boyd was a veteran field adjuster, a man with 3 decades of experience who had been unceremoniously fired the previous year. We met in the back corner of a loud, crowded diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. He looked incredibly tired, his eyes darting nervously toward the entrance every time the door chimed. When I laid out the printed list of property names, he let out a harsh, bitter breath. "I flagged 3 of those exact sites," Boyd said, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. The burn patterns did not match the official point of origin. I requested authorization to bring in a specialized forensic unit. The next morning, my regional director handed me a printed list of addresses. He called it the Do Not Touch list. He said those files were being handled exclusively by the executive floor. When I pushed back and threatened to take my findings to the State Oversight Board, Human Resources terminated me exactly 48 hours later for supposed insubordination. I returned home and brought Miles back into the fold. He was no longer just an electrician hired to fix a light. He was my primary technical asset. I laid Graham's macro photographs across the marble kitchen island. Miles leaned over the glossy images of the ruined circuit breakers, his experienced eyes scanning the metallic damage. He tapped a thick, calloused finger against an extreme close-up shot of a manufacturer's serial number. "Look right here at the edge of the stamped digits," Miles explained, his tone shifting into confident, professional territory. "Those are grinder marks. Whoever supplied these panels took cheap, low-voltage commercial switches, physically filed off the original rating numbers, and used a cold press to stamp new, high-capacity ratings over the bare metal. It is incredibly crude. Anyone who actually works with their hands for a living would spot this fake instantly. That is exactly why they had to ensure the independent inspectors never got inside those basements. We had the motive, the method, and the digital paper trail. Now, I needed to ensure it could not be buried a second time. I spent the next 10 hours creating encrypted backups of everything. We divided the raw data onto 3 separate, high-capacity external drives. I hid the first one inside the false bottom of a heavy ceramic planter on my back patio. Miles took the second drive and locked it in a secure storage facility registered under his sister's maiden name. The third went into a waterproof bag, hidden behind a loose brick in my basement foundation. Finally, I sat in the dark of Graham's office and coded an automated dead man switch. I drafted a comprehensive email containing the encrypted links to the server logs, Graham's diaries, and the high-resolution photographs. I programmed the server to blast the email to the State Insurance Commissioner, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and 3 major investigative news outlets. The timer was set for 72 hours. If I did not manually log in and reset the countdown, the entire city of Ashport would explode. For the first time since the night the police knocked on my door, I was no longer a grieving or passive widow. I was a loaded weapon. As I watched the digital timer begin its silent countdown on my screen, the final, horrific truth settled deep into my bones. The people who ran this city had not just silenced my husband because he asked too many questions. They were not merely covering their tracks. They had meticulously studied our lives. They had leveraged my career, my access, and my blind trust. Killing Graham was only the first half of their master plan. The second half was watching me slowly walk into a trap I could not see, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the entire burning city squarely onto my shoulders, exactly 48 hours after I breached the hidden sanctuary. The piercing shriek of my home security system shattered the silence of 4 in the morning. I woke up with my heart hammering violently against my ribs, the metallic taste of pure adrenaline flooding my mouth. I did not turn on the bedside lamp. I slipped out of bed, grabbed the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth, and pressed my back against the cold bedroom wall. Through the relentless wailing of the alarm, I listened to the sounds of the invasion. There was no chaotic rummaging. There was no sound of shattering glass in the living room where my expensive electronics and inherited silver sat in plain sight. Instead, I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps moving rapidly up the hardwood stairs. The intruder knew exactly where they were going. The footsteps crossed the second-floor landing and stopped directly in front of Graham's office. By the time the private security response vehicle pulled into my driveway 10 minutes later, the house was entirely empty. The back patio door had been expertly jimmied open. When I finally stepped into my late husband's office, the air felt disturbed, thick with the lingering presence of a stranger. The heavy mahogany bookcase had been violently shoved aside. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at the exposed wall, but the secret remained buried. Miles had spent 6 grueling hours the previous afternoon meticulously reconstructing the temporary drywall barrier, applying quick-drying plaster and a fresh coat of gray paint specifically to mask our intrusion. The intruder had dragged their hands across the fresh surface, leaving faint, desperate smudge marks, but they had not breached the cavity. They left empty-handed. The reality of those smudge marks sent a terrifying shiver down my spine. This was not a random burglary. Whoever orchestrated this had been watching the house. They had been waiting patiently for 24 months, terrified that Graham had left a physical cache behind, yet unable to tear the house apart without drawing federal suspicion. My recent flurry of activity with the electrician had clearly triggered their tripwire. The hunt was officially active. I retreated to my kitchen, locked every deadbolt, and began scouring the secondary pile of receipts I had pulled from the safe. Hidden between two faded hardware store invoices was a small, thermal-printed slip of paper. It was a monthly rental receipt for locker number 42 at the Briar Cove Marina. I drove to the waterfront just as the pale morning sun began to burn off the thick coastal fog. The marina was a ghost town of bobbing fiberglass and clinking metal riggings. I found the bank of rusted storage lockers near the harbormaster's office. The small brass key from Graham's desk turned smoothly in the lock. The heavy metal door swung open, releasing the sharp scent of damp nylon and stale seawater. Folded neatly on the bottom shelf was Graham's bright yellow raincoat. Sitting on top of the waterproof fabric was a plastic dock access card, a small black data drive, and an unsealed white envelope. I took the drive back to the absolute privacy of my locked car, plugged it into my laptop, and opened the single video file it contained. It was a raw, unfiltered copy of the security camera footage from the night Graham died. I had seen the official police version a dozen times during the initial investigation. The precinct's copy showed my husband walking alone down the slick, rain-swept wooden pier, eventually stepping into a dark blind spot between two large yachts just moments before he supposedly lost his footing. But the video playing on my screen did not end there. Graham's copy continued for another 3 minutes. The grainy black and white footage showed a second figure emerging from the shadows of the boathouse, walking purposefully toward the blind spot where Graham was waiting. The man was tall, wearing a heavy trench coat, and he moved with a very distinct, confident stride as he passed directly beneath a flickering halogen security light. His face was clearly illuminated for just 2 seconds. I stopped the video. I zoomed in on the frozen frame. The air in my car suddenly became completely unbreathable. The man meeting my husband on the dock in the middle of a torrential storm was not a random corporate whistleblower or a hired thug. It was Travis Kennedy. He was Graham's older brother, a highly respected city councilman, and the most beloved political figure in Ashport. My vision blurred as a wave of profound nausea washed over me. Travis, the man who had held me the tightest at the cemetery, the brother-in-law who had gently managed all the complex probate paperwork so I would not have to stress over the legalities, the trusted family member who had spent the last 2 years constantly, softly urging me to sell the old house and move out of the city to seek a fresh start. He had not been comforting me. He had been managing me. He had been trying to get me out of the house before I found the walls. With trembling fingers, I opened the unsealed envelope. Graham's handwriting was rushed, the ink smeared as if written in a desperate hurry. If this video is still here, it means I did not live long enough to give it to the right person. I threw the car into drive and sped back to my house. I tore through the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, searching frantically for the official coroner's report I had buried beneath old tax returns. I flipped through the heavy, clinical pages until I found the toxicology section. During the initial shock of his death, I had barely registered the complex medical jargon. The police had assured me it was a straightforward drowning. Now, reading with the clinical precision of an investigator, I saw the glaring anomaly. The lab had detected traces of a mild, fast-acting sedative in his bloodstream. The lead detective had casually dismissed it as an over-the-counter cold medication, attributing any residual dizziness to the freezing rain and sheer exhaustion. But combined with the secret meeting with Travis, it paints a horrifying, undeniable picture of calculated incapacitation. They had drugged him, walked him to the edge of the slick wood, and pushed him into the freezing dark. I gathered every single piece of evidence: the digital drives, the printed ledgers, the marina video, and the autopsy report. I placed them into a heavy leather briefcase and drove directly to the federal courthouse downtown. Graham's notes had mentioned June Halbrook, a notoriously ruthless federal financial crimes prosecutor he had considered contacting just days before his murder. I waited in her austere, windowless reception area for 3 hours before she finally agreed to give me 15 minutes of her time. When I first sat down at her polished conference table, June looked at me with the polite, weary skepticism reserved for grieving widows who could not accept a tragic accident. She sat with her arms crossed, her expression completely guarded. I did not waste time with emotional pleas. I opened the laptop, turned the screen toward her, and pressed play on the uncut Marina footage. I watched her eyes narrow as Travis Kennedy's face appeared under the halogen light. Next, I placed the highlighted toxicology report directly in front of her, followed immediately by the printed cross-ownership maps linking the corrupted real estate to the city council's zoning committees. The guarded skepticism vanished from June Halbrook's face. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. She slowly closed the thick file folder, interlaced her fingers, and leaned forward, looking at me with absolute, predatory focus. "Mrs. Kennedy?" June said, her voice a sharp, commanding blade slicing through the quiet room. "This is no longer just a dirty insurance scam or a localized case of material fraud. If we can successfully connect this dark money chain, the falsified property acquisitions, and the deliberate murder of your husband, Ashport is about to face a legal explosion that will swallow the entire local business sector and the political establishment whole." Monday morning arrived, and walking back through the revolving glass doors of Crown Harbor Mutual required a level of psychological detachment I never knew I possessed. I wore my standard navy blue suit, held my usual order of black coffee, and greeted the front desk security guard by name. I sat through a grueling 90-minute departmental review at 9 o'clock. Keeping my voice perfectly modulated, my posture relaxed, and my facial expressions professionally pleasant. Nobody looking at me across the polished mahogany conference table could possibly guess that I was mentally cataloging them as potential accomplices to murder. Beneath the veneer of the dedicated corporate employee, I was running a silent, relentless offensive. The moment I returned to my cubicle, I minimized my standard underwriting software and opened a deep-level diagnostic program. I began systematically pulling deleted communication logs from the internal server, hunting for the specific authorization codes Graham had flagged in his physical files. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, my desk phone chimed. It was Vivian Roque's executive assistant, asking me to step into the corner office. Vivian's office was a masterclass in intimidating elegance, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Ashport skyline and a massive glass desk that offered absolutely no place to hide. When I walked in, Vivian smiled. It was a flawless, warm expression that did not reach her calculating eyes. She gestured for me to sit down on the plush leather sofa, adopting a tone of profound, sisterly concern. "Eleanor, I wanted to check in on you," Vivian said softly, leaning forward. "I know this time of year is always difficult, but I also wanted to discuss a minor administrative matter." While cleaning up some legacy vendor files, we found a few outstanding balances related to Graham's unfinished consulting contracts with the firm. I would like to quietly expedite those payments for you, just to ease any lingering financial burdens. Consider it a professional courtesy. Every muscle in my back locked into rigid tension. Graham was an independent forensic contractor. His invoices were processed exclusively through the blind accounting department, not the executive vice president of claims. There was absolutely no legitimate operational reason for Vivian to even have visibility on his specific billing structures, let alone offer to manually push them through. It was not a courtesy, it was a thinly veiled probe. She was dangling his name to see if I would flinch, offering me a sanitized bribe to ensure my continued docility. I forced a polite, grateful smile to my lips. "Thank you, Vivian. I truly appreciate the thought, but the probate lawyers have already closed his estate accounts. Processing anything new right now would just create a massive tax headache for me. But your kindness means the world." She studied my face for 3 agonizing seconds before her warm smile returned. Of course, Eleanor. My door is always open. I left her office feeling like I had just backed away from a coiled viper. Returning to my computer, my data recovery script finally hit a solid nerve. I found a cluster of restored emails sent between Vivian's private executive terminal and an external server registered to a subsidiary of Vane Capital. The correspondence never mentioned electrical fires, property damage, or counterfeit components. Instead, they relied on a sterile, highly coordinated corporate language. They referred to the targeted buildings exclusively as weathered assets. The weathered asset on Elm Street is ready for accelerated processing. One email read, "Initiate closure on the riverfront weathered asset." Thresholds are clear. Read another. It was a brilliantly simple cipher. By categorizing these massive, fraudulent payouts under a vague internal designation, they completely bypass the automated risk algorithms designed to flag suspicious clusters of electrical claims. That evening, I met June Halbrook in the suffocating quiet of a private study room at the county law library. She had spent the last 48 hours ripping apart the financial fabric of the city. She unrolled a large sheet of paper across the table, revealing a complex web of corporate entities. "Follow the money, and the shadows disappear," June said, tapping a red pen against the paper. Every single shell company that purchased those burned properties was capitalized by a massive blind trust. I finally cracked the administrative layer of that trust. The primary trustee is a senior wealth manager who just happens to be Travis Kennedy's former college roommate and current campaign finance director. She drew a hard line connecting the trust to the municipal government. And here is how they got away with the physical sabotage. We audited the city permitting office. Martin Bell, the director of structural compliance, personally signed off on technical waivers for every single one of these renovation projects. He legally exempted those specific buildings from undergoing high-voltage stress tests. He basically held the door wide open for the contractors to install the fake switchgears without any fear of a municipal inspector catching them. My burner phone vibrated against the wooden table. It was an encrypted file transfer from Boyd Kessler. The disgraced field adjuster had finally decided that his fear of being implicated was greater than his fear of Vivian Roque. I opened the document. It was a scanned copy of a 3-year-old internal memorandum. Boyd had formally requested a secondary, independent fire marshal review on a destroyed warehouse. Scrawled across the top of the page, in Vivian's unmistakable handwriting, was a direct denial. Request denied. Vivian had written, "Reputational risk to the firm currently outweighs the stated technical risk. Process the settlement immediately." It was the ultimate smoking gun of corporate suppression, but our momentum was immediately countered by a brutal reality check. 10 minutes later, Miles called me. He sounded breathless, his voice tight with raw panic. "Eleanor, they are coming for me," Miles said. "A city inspector just showed up at my current job site. They slapped a stop work order on the property and handed me a notice of license suspension. They claim an anonymous source reported me for executing unpermitted, dangerous wiring on a residential property. They are trying to destroy my livelihood." The invisible net was tightening. They knew I was looking, and they were systematically isolating me by attacking the people standing in my corner. June stared at the sprawling map of corruption on the table, summarizing the terrifying machine we were up against. "It is a perfectly closed loop, Eleanor. Hollis Vane creates the vacuum by manufacturing the disasters. Martin Bell provides the legal cover to ensure the traps are set. Vivian Roque controls the insurance payouts to fund the acquisitions. And your brother-in-law, Travis Kennedy, uses his political clout and family name to keep the police looking the other way." I sat in the cold, fluorescent light of the library, staring at Travis's name written on the chart. The corporate mechanics of the fraud were undeniably brilliant and utterly vile. But the personal betrayal was a physical weight crushing my chest. The deepest, most agonizing wound was not simply that a politician was corrupt. It was the horrifying realization of what that corruption meant for my own life. Graham had not just been murdered by a syndicate, he had been led to the slaughter by his own flesh and blood. And the true horror was that for months after I buried my husband, I had continued to invite his killer into my home. I had poured Travis glasses of red wine during Thanksgiving. I had smiled at him across the dining room table, seeking comfort from the very hands that had pushed the love of my life into the freezing, unforgiving water. The grief I had carried for 2 years instantly burned away, replaced entirely by a pure, absolute demand for ruin. I knelt on the rough carpet of the hidden room for what felt like the 100th time, staring into the dark, hollow belly of the fireproof safe. I had emptied its contents days ago, but a strange, nagging instinct told me I was missing a final piece of the architecture. Graham never left dead space in his designs. I reached my arm all the way inside, pressing my palm flat against the cold steel floor of the box. My fingertips caught on a microscopic seam near the back left corner. I pushed down hard, and a false bottom sprang upward with a dull metallic thud. Beneath the steel plate lay one last envelope. It was not sealed. Written across the front in thick black marker were 8 words: "Only open when you know all their names." I knew their names: Hollis Vane, Martin Bell, Vivian Roque, Travis Kennedy. I pulled the single sheet of paper from the envelope. It was not another cross-reference spreadsheet or a list of fraudulent claims. It was a confession, laid bare in my husband's jagged handwriting. In my earlier discoveries, Graham had admitted to signing off on a flawed report out of sheer exhaustion and bureaucratic pressure. That was a lie of omission. The paper in my trembling hands revealed the agonizing, unvarnished truth. 5 years ago, long before he understood the monstrous scale of the syndicate, Graham had been approached by a proxy representing Hollis Vane. We had been drowning in the suffocating medical debt from his mother's final months in hospice care. The proxy offered Graham a highly irregular, off-the-books payment of $55,000. They called it a special consulting fee to simply expedite the preliminary structural review on a massive downtown renovation project. Graham took the money. He signed the paper. He let the substandard electrical framework pass without a mandatory secondary inspection. The air evacuated my lungs. I dropped the letter onto the floor as if it were soaked in poison. My husband was not a pristine, untouchable hero who had accidentally stumbled upon a dragon's lair. He had helped forge the dragon's teeth. The $55,000 was not enough to prove he was a master architect of the grand conspiracy, but it was the original sin that bound him to the syndicate. He had spent the final year of his life desperately hunting these monsters, not just for justice, but for redemption. He was trying to violently rip out a rotten link in a chain that he had personally helped forge. The towering, heroic statue of the man I loved violently shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces inside my mind. I sat in the silent room, weeping bitterly for the death of my own naivety. The profound love I held for Graham remained fiercely alive, but it was no longer a simple, innocent love. It was stained. I had to swallow the agonizing reality that my husband was incredibly brave, but he was fundamentally flawed. The next morning, I placed the confession on the polished mahogany table in June Hallbrook's austere office. The federal prosecutor read the handwritten letter twice. Her face was a mask of cold, calculating stone. "If we try to paint your husband as a saint, we will lose everything," June said, her voice completely devoid of sympathy. "If we take this to a grand jury and hide this bribe, the defense attorneys for Vane and Roque will inevitably find the financial anomaly. They only need one tiny crack to shatter the credibility of our primary witness. They will reframe this entire case. They will tell the jury that Graham was just a greedy, corrupt contractor who tried to extort his wealthy partners and got himself killed in a dispute over dirty money." I looked at the federal prosecutor, feeling a cold, steel resolve hardening in my chest. "So, what is the alternative?" "You burn his myth before they can," June replied sharply. "You hand this confession directly to the judge. You voluntarily present the absolute worst thing your husband ever did. If you expose the whole ugly truth first, they lose their only piece of leverage. But you need to understand the cost. Eleanor, if you do this, his legacy in this city will be destroyed. People will call him a criminal. I thought about the dark water at the marina. I thought about the fake smiles in my office. Do it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but entirely steady. I chose the most agonizing path available. I would not protect the comfortable, fictional ghost of a perfect husband. I would protect the raw, bleeding truth of a man who stumbled in the dark, and then sacrificed his own life trying to find the light again. But to execute the final phase of June's legal trap, I needed Travis Kennedy to implicate himself on a recorded line. I invited my brother-in-law over for a quiet Thursday evening dinner. I spent 3 hours roasting a chicken and selecting a heavy, expensive bottle of red wine, meticulously setting the stage of the grieving, overwhelmed widow. When Travis arrived, he wore his signature tailored suit and a warm, practiced smile. He poured the wine, patted my hand gently, and asked how I was holding up with the house. I am struggling. Travis, I lied, looking down at my plate, letting my voice waver perfectly. I was looking through some old files today. I keep thinking about that night. The police report is just so sterile. It says he fell off the main walkway. I just cannot picture it. Graham was always so careful on his feet. Travis took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine. He leaned back in the dining chair, a look of profound, patronizing pity on his face. Ellie, you have to let this go. The storm was blinding that night. The wood near the north fueling slip is notoriously treacherous. There is a rusted cleat right on the edge. He just lost his footing. It was a tragedy. Nothing more. My heart stopped beating for a full 3 seconds. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on my wineglass, terrified that if I looked up, he would see the absolute murder burning in my eyes. The official police report released to the family and the press stated that Graham fell from the primary central dock. The north fueling slip was a restricted, unlit area completely sectioned off from the public path. The detail about the rusted cleat had never been published anywhere. The only way Travis could have known the exact state of the wood and the precise spot where it gave way was if he had been standing there, watching the whole thing unfold. He had just handed me exactly what I needed to bring the truth to light. I waited until he left. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, I sat at my kitchen counter, connected my digital audio recorder to my cellular phone, and dialed his number. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding tired. Travis, I said, letting a frantic, borderline hysterical edge bleed into my voice. I cannot sleep. I keep thinking about what you said at dinner, about the north slip. I think I need to call the detective tomorrow. I think they missed something. I think Graham found something terrible at work, and someone followed him to the marina. There was a long, terrifying silence on the other end of the line. The warm, familial affection completely vanished from his tone. When he finally spoke, his voice was a cold, terrifying rasp, stripped of all political polish. Eleanor, listen to me very carefully, Travis said, delivering a chilling combination of a threat and a final warning. Do not call the police. Do not go digging through his old files. Graham died because he insisted on digging up things that should have stayed at the bottom of the water. Do not make the exact same mistake he did. Go to sleep. He hung up the phone. I pressed the stop button on the digital recorder. The green light blinked, confirming the audio file was saved. I sat alone in the dark kitchen, the silence of the house pressing against my shoulders. I was no longer a confused widow searching for closure. I was a woman who had willingly shattered the final, beautiful illusion of her life to secure the unvarnished truth. They had taken my husband. Now, I was going to take their entire world. The pieces needed to be moved across the board before they even realized a game was being played. On Tuesday morning, I walked into the Crown Harbor Mutual break room looking intentionally fragile. I had deliberately skipped my usual meticulous makeup routine, left my navy suit jacket slightly wrinkled, and ensured my hands trembled just enough when I poured my morning coffee. I strategically positioned myself next to the underwriting division's most notorious gossip, a senior analyst who treated corporate rumors like high-value currency. I let out a heavy, ragged sigh and allowed my voice to crack as I confessed my manufactured despair. I told her I had finally reached my absolute breaking point. I said the ghosts in the Marlow Bluff house had become entirely too loud, the memories too heavy, and that I was contacting a premier real estate agent on Friday afternoon to aggressively list the property. Most importantly, I leaned in close and whispered that I was hiring a commercial disposal crew to completely gut Graham's home office by the end of the week, throwing every single one of his old files straight into an industrial dumpster without a second glance. It took exactly 4 hours for that carefully planted seed to travel up to the executive suite. Shortly after 1 o'clock, Vivian Roque summoned me. She did not use her assistant this time. She walked directly to my cubicle and softly asked me to join her. Once the heavy glass door of her office clicked shut, she bypassed the usual corporate pleasantries. She looked at me with an expression of deeply practiced, artificial empathy. "Eleanor, I heard about your decision to sell the house," Vivian said, her tone dripping with manufactured warmth. "I know how agonizing that choice must be, but I truly believe it is the healthiest step forward. However, it also brings up a delicate administrative vulnerability for the firm." She slid a sleek dark blue folder across the glass desk. I opened it to find a highly lucrative severance and consulting contract, colloquially known in our industry as a life transition support package. It guaranteed my current salary for the next 36 months, completely tax-free, alongside a comprehensive security detail for my relocation. But the true cost of the money was buried on the 4th page. It was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement requiring me to legally swear that my late husband had illegally retained highly classified internal claims documents, and that I was returning or destroying them under corporate supervision. "We just need to tidy up the loose ends," Vivian murmured, leaning over her desk. "Sign the transition package. Eleanor, let us handle the disposal crew for his office. We will ensure everything is managed with the utmost discretion, and you can simply walk away into a comfortable, secure new life." I channeled every ounce of my remaining grief and twisted it into a mask of pure hesitation. I let my eyes dart nervously around the room, clutching the folder tightly against my chest. "Vivian, this is an overwhelming amount of legal text. I cannot just sign this right now. I need a day to process this. Can we meet tomorrow evening, outside the office, somewhere quiet where I can read this without feeling like the entire department is watching me?" Vivian smiled, a sharp, victorious expression flashing across her face. "Of course, the private lounge at the Harbor Dominion Hotel, 8 o'clock tomorrow night. Take a deep breath. Eleanor, the worst is almost over." She had no idea how right she was. The moment I left the building, I drove straight to the federal courthouse. June Halbrook immediately filed an emergency motion with a district judge, securing a legal surveillance warrant based on my direct testimony of attempted corporate bribery and witness coercion. By the time I met Vivian the next night, I would be wearing a state-of-the-art audio transmitter taped securely beneath my blouse, capturing every single threat and payout she offered. While I managed the corporate front, our technical offensive was advancing rapidly. Miles Dugan was no longer just hiding in my basement. He was actively out in the field. Using a perfectly gained work order I had generated through a ghost account in the insurance database, Miles' access bypassed the private security at an abandoned textile factory on the edge of the industrial district. It was a massive, decaying brick structure slated for imminent redevelopment, and a prime target listed in Graham's encrypted ledgers. Armed with his heavy tool belt and a high-lumen flashlight, Miles navigated the damp, pitch-black basement of the factory until he found the primary utility room. He pried open the heavy steel covers of the main distribution panels. What he found was the exact physical manifestation of our entire theory. He recorded a continuous, high-definition video on his phone, running his light over the internal components. He documented the exact same counterfeit switchgear models, and he zoomed in tight on the crude, abrasive grinder marks where the original factory's serial numbers had been violently shaved down and overstamped with fake high-voltage ratings. It was a perfect, undeniable physical match to the photographs Graham had taken 2 years prior. Simultaneously, we secured the final piece of the historical puzzle. Boyd Kessler, the disgraced field adjuster, finally found the courage to step entirely out of the shadows. He refused to send it digitally. We met in the freezing rain at an empty transit station. With shaking hands, Boyd handed me a clear plastic sleeve containing the original, hard copy memorandum from 3 years ago. It was not a scanned duplicate. It was the physical paper, bearing the unmistakable pressure of Vivian Roque's blue fountain pen. The ink clearly spelled out her direct, explicit order to her underwriting team to artificially lower the technical risk assessment levels on several massive commercial claims. Her written justification was solely to prevent the automatic triggering of independent safety audits by their global reinsurance partners. I laid the physical memo, Miles's fresh video files, and the signed transition contract on June Halbrook's desk. The federal prosecutor arranged the evidence like a general reviewing a battlefield map. "We have the fraudulent mechanics," June stated, her voice tight with anticipation. "We have the physical counterfeit materials currently sitting in a Target building. We have the documented history of corporate suppression. This is enough to petition a grand jury for sealed arrest warrants covering wire fraud and criminal conspiracy." June paused, tapping her pen against the wood. "But there is a catch. If we arrest them in isolated locations right now, they will immediately hire defense teams, point fingers at each other, and claim ignorance. Martin Bell will say he was tricked by bad engineering reports. Hollis Vane will claim he is just a lucky real estate buyer. To guarantee a federal racketeering conviction, I need one final, undeniable act of direct coordination between all four of our primary targets. I need them to pull the trigger on the money while they are all communicating together." I went back to the financial ledgers, searching for the catalyst. It did not take long to find. The syndicate was not just planning another isolated fire. They were preparing to close the absolute largest transaction in the history of Ashport. It was a municipal redevelopment bond package valued at over $300 million, earmarked for the total revitalization of the city's dilapidated riverfront district. I cross-referenced the public bidding documents with our hidden files. Dozens of the subcontracting firms listed as the primary beneficiaries of this massive taxpayer bond shared the exact same dirty supply chains, legal representation, and dummy corporate officers that Graham had spent his final year tracking. Hollis Vane was the lead developer. Martin Bell was the city official championing the permit fast tracks. Vivian Roque's firm was underwriting the municipal completion guarantees. And Councilman Travis Kennedy was the politician scheduled to cast the deciding, tie-breaking vote to release the funds. I realized instantly that if this massive bond package was legally approved by the city council and the funds were subsequently transferred into their labyrinth of shell companies, the dirty money would be permanently scattered. It would be entirely legitimized, washed clean through the municipal budget, and become completely impossible to track or recover. The federal agents wanted to freeze the accounts and block the vote from the outside. I adamantly refused. Shutting the door before they walked through would only scatter the rats. I wanted them to feel the absolute certainty of their victory. I decided we would let them march right up to the very pinnacle of their unchecked greed. We would let them gather to celebrate their massive triumph, and then I would flip the table right in the exact place they believed they were the safest. The clock was bleeding out. We were exactly 48 hours away from the municipal bond vote and the exclusive, backstage gala intended to celebrate the selling of Ashport's soul. Through June Halbrook's federal wiretaps and financial tracing, we watched the syndicate accelerate their final preparations. Travis was quietly funneling massive amounts of liquid capital through a shell philanthropic family fund to prepare for the property acquisitions. Hollis Vane was aggressively pressuring the city clerk's office to finalize the signing schedules before the weekend. Meanwhile, my own data recovery script picked up a horrifying new digital file being built on the executive server. Vivian was meticulously compiling a comprehensive dossier of forged system logs, explicitly designed to frame me for every single unauthorized file access over the past 3 years. She was building my coffin. June brought me into her austere federal office, laying out the brutal reality of our timeline. She explained that our window of opportunity was terrifyingly narrow. If the strike team moved too early, before the funds were irrevocably committed and the final contracts signed, the defense attorneys would simply cry foul, claiming a complete lack of direct coordination between the parties. They would dismiss the entire conspiracy as a series of unfortunate, disconnected coincidences. However, if we moved even 1 minute too late, the massive influx of taxpayer money would vanish into offshore accounts. The distressed properties would officially change hands, and the resulting legal battle would drag on for decades in civil court. I had to step directly into the blast radius. I formally agreed to attend the lavish evening reception at the Harbor Dominion Hotel. I would be walking into a closed room packed with the very people who orchestrated the murder of my husband. To ensure they would be off balance and desperate enough to make a fatal error on tape, I needed to inject a potent dose of pure paranoia into their celebration. Early that morning, I conveniently broke down in tears in front of the firm's human resources director. Between manufactured sobs, I let slip a devastating lie. I confessed that I was terrified because I could not find Graham's second ledger, a supposedly detailed physical notebook he kept hidden somewhere outside the house, containing names and transaction dates. I knew that piece of gossip would reach Vivian's desk in less than an hour. While the syndicate panicked over a phantom book, the real net tightened. During a routine municipal oversight hearing that afternoon, Martin Bell sat under oath and blatantly, arrogantly denied ever granting safety waivers for any substandard electrical systems in the city. He lied to the committee with a perfectly straight face. At that exact moment, the counterfeit switchgear Miles had successfully extracted from the abandoned textile factory was being rushed through an expedited forensic metallurgy analysis at the federal lab to definitively prove the fraud. We also had our eyes inside the venue. Miles, leveraging his union credentials and a perfectly forged event staffing contract, was legally embedded at the hotel as the primary electrical technician for the ballroom's audiovisual setup. He had total, unrestricted access to the backstage utility corridors, waiting for June's tactical signal. Before putting on my black evening gown, I sat alone in my bedroom and forced myself to listen to the final, hidden audio recording Graham had left in the safe. I did not play it to seek comfort or to soften my grieving heart. I listened to his strained, exhausted voice to forge my spine into absolute steel. I needed to hear the fear in his breath to remember exactly why I had to burn this entire city down, even knowing that doing so would publicly expose his own devastating moral failures. There was no room left for a widow's hesitation. The man I loved was dead, and tonight, I was the executioner. The Harbor Dominion Hotel ballroom was a masterclass in opulent, localized corruption. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the wealthy elite of Ashport. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne. The air hummed with the smooth, confident laughter of people who believed they were utterly untouchable. I stood near the edge of the room, keeping my breathing slow and measured, scanning the crowd. I saw them all. Hollis Vane was holding court near the grand piano, nursing a scotch. Martin Bell was sweating slightly, constantly checking his phone. Travis stood in the center of the room, working the crowd with his polished, political charm, shaking hands and securing the final votes. And then, there was Vivian. Vivian wore a stunning emerald dress, looking every bit the triumphant queen of the corporate underworld. The moment she spotted me, her eyes locked onto mine like a predator tracking a wounded animal. She did not send an assistant. She glided across the ballroom floor, wrapped a firm, cold hand around my arm, and smoothly guided me away from the crowded bar toward a secluded, dimly lit alcove near the velvet curtains. "Eleanor," Vivian purred, her voice sweet as honey, yet carrying the sharp, suffocating tension of a tightened wire. "I was surprised you decided to come tonight, given your current fragile state. Especially with this distressing rumor floating around the office today about a missing notebook. I just want it all to be over." "Vivian," I whispered, keeping my eyes wide and fearful, ensuring the hidden microphone taped beneath my silk bodice captured every single syllable. "I just want to sign the papers and leave. I do not know anything about a second ledger." Vivian's smile dropped, replaced by a look of sheer, terrifying coldness. She leaned in so close I could smell the expensive gin on her breath. "You need to stop looking for things that do not exist, Eleanor," she hissed, her words deliberate and lethal. "Your husband should have taken the deal when I offered it to him. People who die of stubbornness always leave the bill for the living." The entire ballroom seemed to fade into absolute silence. My heart slammed against my ribs, but my mind was diamond clear. That single, arrogant sentence transformed the night from a dangerous gamble into an inescapable trap. Vivian Roque had just casually admitted, on a federally monitored wire, that Graham had been explicitly offered hush money directly by her before he was killed. She had just handed us the murder. There was no turning back now. I did not flinch when Vivian delivered her veiled threat. I kept my breathing slow and even, forcing my heart rate to settle. I looked at her with wide, desperate eyes, playing the broken widow to absolute perfection. "What do you mean, Vivian?" I asked, my voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "What deal did he refuse?" Vivian sighed, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist with terrifying nonchalance. "Graham was a brilliant architect, Eleanor, but he lacked corporate vision. We offered him a highly lucrative consulting retainer. All he had to do was review a few key technical conclusions on those commercial files and sign his name. He chose to be difficult. And difficult people find themselves in tragic accidents." Before I could press her further, Hollis Vane pushed his way through the velvet curtains. His face was flushed red, his jaw tight with poorly concealed rage. He did not care about the surrounding crowd. He leaned in, pointing a thick finger at me. "Where is the second ledger, Eleanor?" Hollis demanded, his voice a harsh rasp. "We know he kept a physical backup. Tell us where it is, or this transition package disappears tonight." Travis Kennedy rushed in right behind him, placing a manicured hand firmly on the developer's shoulder. "Hollis, lower your voice. You are creating a scene." Travis turned to me, putting on that sickening, warm, familial mask. "Ellie, please, we are just trying to protect you from Graham's mess. If he had just gone straight home after having those drinks with me that night, instead of wandering down to the North fueling slip, none of us would be in this situation." My blood ran completely cold, but a fierce, triumphant fire ignited in my chest. Travis had just explicitly confessed to drinking with Graham on the night of the murder, placing himself at the exact scene, directly contradicting his sworn statement to the police that he had not seen his brother in weeks. He knew it was the North Slip. He knew about the drinks because he was the one who slipped the sedative into the glass. In the surveillance van parked 3 blocks away, I knew June Halbrook was listening. She had the federal agents stacked at every single exit of the Harbor Dominion Hotel, but she did not give the breach order. She held them back. We needed the absolute final lock on the conspiracy. Vivian stepped between me and the 2 men, playing the velvet hammer. She pulled a folded document from her evening bag. "Sign the non-disclosure agreement right now, Eleanor," Vivian ordered smoothly. "You get the money. You get to keep your pristine reputation in the industry, and I will personally ensure that every single unauthorized entry log flagged under your name in the company mainframe is permanently wiped clean by morning. Refuse, and you take the fall for the whole operation." The wire recorded every single word of the extortion. The trap was sprung. I looked at Vivian, then at Travis, and finally at Hollis. I let the mask of the terrified widow slide completely off my face. I stood up straight, smoothing the silk of my dress, and offered them a very small, utterly chilling smile. "I think I will pass," I said clearly. At that exact second, Miles Dugan threw the main breaker in the basement utility room. The grand crystal chandeliers of the ballroom instantly died. The music cut out, replaced by the confused, rising murmurs of 300 wealthy guests plunged into sudden, suffocating darkness. The blackout lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then, the massive digital projection screens flanking the main stage flickered to life. They did not display the municipal bond logo. Instead, the blinding white light of the screens illuminated the horrified faces of the syndicate. It was Graham. His face filled the screens, looking hollowed out, exhausted, but his eyes burned with an undeniable, piercing clarity. The audio system kicked in, projecting his deep, steady voice across the silent ballroom. "My name is Graham Kennedy," the recording echoed off the high ceilings. "And if you are watching this, I have been murdered. The people responsible are standing in this room." A wave of absolute shock ripped through the crowd. I watched Vivian freeze, her perfect composure shattering into raw panic. On the screen, Graham did not hesitate. He methodically named them: Hollis Vane, Vivian Roque, Martin Bell, Travis Kennedy. He clearly and clinically detailed the entire mechanical slaughter of the city. He explained the counterfeit switches, the intentionally triggered fires, the manipulated insurance payouts, and the blind trusts used to buy the ashes. Then, Graham looked directly into the camera lens. "Ellie, if you are there, do not trust their tears. Trust the numbers. Trust the paper trails. Trust what cannot lie." The moment he finished speaking, the screens erupted into a rapid-fire sequence of undeniable proof. The unedited marina security footage played, showing Travis walking onto the pier. Then came the high-resolution internal logs proving Vivian had hijacked my employee credentials. Boyd Kessler's handwritten memo flashed next, followed by Miles's fresh, high-definition video of the filed-down counterfeit equipment currently sitting inside the textile factory, perfectly matched with the bank transfer records tracing the bond money directly to Hollis Vane's holding companies. The alliance broke instantly. The wealthy elite backed away from the four of them as if they carried a lethal virus. Martin Bell began screaming at the top of his lungs, blindly denying he ever signed the waivers. Hollis Vane grabbed Vivian by the arm, violently cursing her for leaving a digital trail. But it was Travis who completely unraveled. Surrounded by the people who had funded his political career, he dropped to his knees, pointed a shaking finger at Vivian, and practically sobbed his confession. "It was her!" Travis screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "Vivian ordered it. She told me I had to get him to the pier. She said he was going to ruin the family fund." The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open. Dozens of federal agents flooded the room, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the evening gowns and tuxedos. June Halbrook walked straight through the chaotic crowd, slapping handcuffs onto Vivian Roque's wrists herself. They were all arrested right there on the polished dance floor. The charges were read aloud over the din of the panicked crowd: massive insurance fraud, federal financial conspiracy, forging official technical documents, extreme public corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. But June did not stop there. The very next morning, she preemptively released Graham's handwritten confession to the federal judge and the press. She deliberately exposed his initial $55,000 bribe. By burning his myth herself, she completely destroyed the defense attorney's strategy. They could not claim the evidence was fabricated by a saint because we proved he was a flawed man. He was a human being who had made a terrible mistake, and then sacrificed his entire existence to tear down the monsters he had accidentally helped feed. The aftermath was swift and brutal. I was fully and publicly exonerated, my name permanently cleared from the corporate logs. The city of Ashport was forced to halt the massive bond issuance and begin tearing open the walls of every single commercial project Martin Bell had ever touched. Late that evening, I drove back to the quiet house in Marlow Bluff. The air inside felt different. It was no longer heavy with unspoken ghosts or buried secrets. I walked up the stairs and stepped into Graham's old office. The heavy drywall patch was still there, a scar on the room, but the oppressive weight of the conspiracy was gone. I reached out and flicked the brass switch on the wall. The overhead light flared to life. It burned bright, warm, and perfectly steady for the first time in 2 years. I stood there, bathed in the glow, knowing it was not because the bulb had finally been fixed. The light stayed on because the terrible secret hiding in the dark had finally been dragged into the sun, and it possessed absolutely no power over me anymore. Thank you so much for listening to this story. And please let me know down in the comments where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, do not forget to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.